The Phantom Front, the Art of the Invisible War. Prologue, The Rubber Battalion. The year was 1944. On the edge of a French forest near the Rhine, a German scout peered through his binoculars and felt his blood run cold. There, in the clearing, sat a column of American Sherman tanks, 30 of them, iron monsters glinting in the morning mist. What the scout didn't know was that if he walked down that hill and poked one of those tanks with a needle, it would pop like a birthday balloon. The men guarding them weren't career soldiers. They were painters from New York, sound technicians from Hollywood, and architects from Philadelphia. They were the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and their mission was simple. If you can't outmuscle the enemy, outsmart them. Chapter 1. The Draft for Dreamers. Jack Miller didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a man who spent too much time in dimly lit jazz clubs with a sketchbook in his lap. When the letter arrived at his Manhattan apartment in 1943, he expected to be sent to a muddy trench with a rifle. Instead, he was sent to Camp Forest, Tennessee. "You're here because you see things differently," Colonel Hilton whispered to the group of recruits. Jack looked around. To his left was a man who designed window displays for Macy's. To his right, a guy who recorded sound effects for radio dramas. "The U.S. Army is building an army of ghosts," the colonel continued. "You will not be fighting with bullets. You will be fighting with perception. You will create atmospheric effects. You will be the reason the Germans think we are where we aren't." Chapter 2. The Symphony of Deception. The training was bizarre. While the 101st Airborne was practicing jumps, Jack's unit was practicing how to make a 93-pound rubber tank look like a 30-ton steel beast. They learned the 4 pillars of deception: visual, inflatable decoys that could be set up in 20 minutes; sonic, massive speakers mounted on half-tracks that played recordings of tank engines and clanking treads, audible from 15 miles away; radio, spooks who would mimic the fist, the specific typing rhythm of real radio operators, to flood the airwaves with fake troop movements; special effects, painting fake insignias on trucks and wearing different shoulder patches to trick local spies into thinking an entire division was moving through town. Jack's job was the visual. He had to learn how to paint fake tire tracks in the mud so German aerial reconnaissance wouldn't realize the tanks didn't have any weight. Chapter 3. The Fog of France. June 1944. The Ghost Army landed in Normandy shortly after D-Day. The reality of war hit Jack the moment he saw the charred remains of a real tank. It was a sobering reminder. Their rubber decoys were designed to draw fire. They were essentially suicide bait. Their first major operation, Operation Bettenberg, required them to fill a dangerous gap in General Patton's line. The line was thin, so thin a German counterattack would have sliced right through. "Blow 'em up, boys!" Jack yelled as the sun set. Under the cover of darkness, the artists hauled the collapsed rubber skins into the fields. With air compressors hissing, the Shermans grew out of the earth. Jack spent hours with a brush, adding mud and rust to the rubber surfaces. Chapter 4. The Sound of Terror. As the visual team finished, the sonic team took over. Sergeant Leo, a former radio engineer, flipped the switch on his 500-pound speakers. The forest began to roar. To anyone listening from the German side, it sounded like a massive armored division was refueling. They played the sound of men shouting, the clatter of mess kits, and the deep, guttural thrum of heavy engines. Jack sat in a foxhole, holding a real rifle he barely knew how to use, praying the Germans wouldn't call the bluff. If a single patrol came close enough to hear the hiss of a leaking valve instead of a diesel engine, they were dead. Chapter 5. The Psychological Toll. The Ghost Army was successful, but they were invisible in more ways than one. Because their work was classified, they couldn't tell their families what they were doing. Jack's letters home to Sarah were vague. "I'm painting a lot, honey. Mostly landscapes," he wrote, omitting the fact that those landscapes were designed to lure the Wehrmacht into a trap. The stress began to wear on the men. They were living a lie 24 hours a day. They went into French cafes and pretended to be drunk soldiers from the 2nd Armored Division, accidentally leaking fake secrets to the bartenders, knowing German informants were listening.
Chapter 6. The Café of Whispers. In the small, bomb-scarred town of Bastogne, the air smelled of wet slate and cheap tobacco. Jack sat in a corner booth of Le Coq d'Or, his uniform purposely disheveled. He wore the patches of the 28th Infantry Division, a unit that was actually 40 miles to the south. "Another round for my brothers," Jack shouted in French, slamming a handful of crumpled francs on the counter. This was atmosphere. It was the most dangerous part of the job. To the villagers and the sharp-eared informants tucked in the shadows, Jack was just another exhausted GI letting his guard down. In reality, he was a performer on a stage where the price of a missed line was a bullet. "Big moves tomorrow, eh, Corporal?" the bartender whispered, leaning in as he wiped the mahogany surface. Jack leaned in, his eyes darting around with practiced paranoia. "Let's just say the Rhine is going to look real crowded by sunrise. Keep the coffee hot." He walked out into the cold night, feeling the weight of the lie. Behind him, he knew the information was already traveling. A baker's son would tell a cousin would tell a man in a gray coat, and by midnight, a German commander would be shifting his panzers toward a ghost. Chapter 7. The Symphony of Steel and Static. While Jack played the drunkard, Sergeant Leo was orchestrating a nightmare. Deep in the woods of the Ardennes, hidden under camouflage netting that looked like natural foliage, were the heater units. These weren't heaters for warmth, they were massive 500-pound state-of-the-art speakers mounted on the back of armored half-tracks. "Cue the bridge construction reel," Leo commanded. The sound technicians hit play on the wire recorders. Suddenly, the silent forest was filled with the cacophony of an entire engineering battalion. The screech of saws, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of pile drivers, and the distant clanking of steel girders echoed through the valley. From 2 miles away, it was indistinguishable from the real thing. To the German scouts listening in the dark, the Americans were building a massive bridge across the river. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Leo whispered, his fingers dancing over the gain knobs. "We're building a bridge out of nothing but magnets and electricity." Chapter 8. The Puncture. Disaster struck on a Tuesday. A stray piece of shrapnel from a distant, unrelated artillery exchange sliced through the turret of tank number 14. Jack watched in horror as the majestic Sherman began to sag. It didn't explode. It didn't catch fire. It groaned like a dying animal as the air hissed out of its rubber skin. "The patch kit! Move!" Jack screamed. If a German reconnaissance plane flew over now and saw a 30-ton tank folded over like a discarded accordion, the secret was out. The entire 23rd would be exposed as a fraud, and the real infantry units they were protecting would be flanked and slaughtered. Jack scrambled into the mud, clutching a bucket of industrial adhesive and a rubber patch. He climbed onto the collapsing steel plate. It felt like jumping on a bouncy castle in the middle of a graveyard. "Hold the compressor!" he yelled to his assistant, Pete. As the German Henschel plane hummed in the distance, Jack slapped the patch over the hole, his hands shaking. He could hear the pilot's engine getting louder. 1 inch, 2 inches. The tank began to re-inflate. He dove under the tank tread just as the plane banked overhead. The pilot saw 30 tanks in perfect formation.
He didn't see the man underneath one of them, covered in glue and sweating cold blood, holding his breath until his lungs burned. Chapter 9. The Ghost in the Mirror. By the winter of 1944, the lines between reality and fiction began to blur for the men of the 23rd. Jack found himself sketching not the war, but the absence of it. He drew empty fields that were supposed to be full, and crowded roads that were actually vacant. One night, near the German border, they captured a prisoner, a young boy no older than 17, wearing a tattered Wehrmacht uniform. "Why didn't you fire?" asked Jack the boy through a translator. "You were right next to our tank column." The boy looked up, his eyes wide with a terrifying kind of awe. "We did fire. We hit 3 of them, but they didn't die. They stood there. We thought you had invented a new kind of metal, a metal that eats bullets." Jack felt a chill. The deception was so perfect, it had crossed into the realm of the supernatural. They weren't just soldiers anymore, they were sorcerers. Chapter 10. Operation Viersen, the grand finale. The Rhine River was the final boss of the European theater. To cross it, the Ninth Army needed a miracle. They needed the Germans to look north while they crossed south. The 23rd was ordered to put on their biggest show yet. They had to simulate 2 full divisions, over 30,000 men, using only 1,100 artists and engineers. "This is it, boys," Colonel Hilton said, his face illuminated by a single candle. "If we fail, the 9th gets pushed back into the river. If we succeed, we end this war by summer." Jack spent 48 hours without sleep. He stayed up painting fake serial numbers on hundreds of trucks. He set up fake mess halls where the smell of real bacon was piped out through fans to convince any local spies that thousands of hungry soldiers were being fed. They even used flash canisters, pyrotechnics designed to mimic the muzzle flashes of heavy artillery. As the sun began to rise over the Rhine, the Ghost Army opened fire, not with shells, but with light and sound. The horizon lit up with the ghost of 1,000 cannons. The speakers roared with the sound of a massive invasion force. On the other side of the river, the German High Command panicked. They redirected their elite panzer divisions north to meet the threat. Meanwhile, 20 miles to the south, the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine against almost zero resistance. They walked across the water while the Germans were busy fighting a bunch of New York illustrators and rubber balloons. Epilogue: The Silence of the Unsung. When the war ended in 1945, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were gathered in a hangar. "You are going home," the general told them, "but you are going home with a burden. You will tell no one, not your wives, not your children, not your biographers. If you speak of the Ghost Army, you will be prosecuted for treason. Your war didn't happen." Jack Miller returned to New York. He became a successful commercial artist. He painted advertisements for Coca-Cola and Buick. People would ask him, "What did you do in the war, Jack?" He would look at his hands, the hands that had built an army out of air, and simply say, "I handled supplies. It was pretty boring, actually." It wasn't until 1996, 51 years later, that the documents were finally declassified. Only then did the world realize that a group of bohemians had saved an estimated 30,000 American lives by simply being the best liars in history. Jack was an old man by then, sitting in a park in Manhattan with a sketchbook. He looked at a child playing with a red balloon. He smiled, picked up his charcoal pencil, and began to draw the outline of a tank that wasn't there.